Hello everyone. Oops. Got my slides wrong. What is happening? Why are you not... There we go. Hello everyone, and welcome back to God Loves Gays, a exploration of history and sexuality. Hello Lobsel, Daniel, Natasha, Marianor, Liz, Miguel. Liz wants to know, when will readings be back? Soon. I know that they kind of got bumped to the side, but this is something that I feel very, very passionate about and I feel is very important, and I know that my voice won't be able to handle both at once. I've had a lot going on at home in general and health things, but hopefully by the end of the month, once our special events are over, we will be back to a normal gaming and reading schedule. But we'll see where all that goes. Welcome to our first actual discussion about Christianity, since we haven't really touched on it yet. We start with this. It's very apocalyptic, isn't it? Unfortunately, that is how Christianity started. It was quite apocalyptic, and we're going to discuss how the real-world historical events that surrounded the life of Jesus and his followers had a really big influence on how the religion was born, what it came to value, and how it came to evolve in the coming centuries. So this is a discussion of the very first Christians in like the first 200 years or so, and the development of the very first gospel, which you may know is the term for the story discussing Jesus and his life and his eventual death. There are 4 in the Bible. There are way more than those in reality, because there were a lot of people writing their own gospels about Jesus, which didn't eventually make the cut in the canonical text, which was not invented until a couple hundred years after all this. But those are topics for another day. Today, we're starting with the war against Rome. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That happened because of a war. In the year 66, all of the tension and anger and pain of the Jewish people in Israel finally erupted into a full-scale war. There had been lots of problems for decades, riots, lots of deaths, lots of executions, but nothing to this extent. Tens of thousands of Jews came from the countryside and gathered together in Jerusalem to make a stand. And unfortunately for them, 60,000 Romans met them. You probably know the Roman Empire was pretty huge and had a lot of money and items on their side, weaponry, armor that the Jewish folks, who were just poor farmers, did not have. It was a massacre. But it was more than that. It was a siege. The Romans camped outside of Jerusalem for some time. They starved the people within. They killed them with disease as dead bodies piled up. There are some really horrible discussions of how mountains of bodies just were surrounding this town and this city, and it was awful. It had been building for a long time. Unfortunately for the Jewish people, not only were they poorer than the Romans, not only were they less equipped, they had intra-group issues as well. They were not united. Specifically, there were three groups that were dividing the Jews of Jerusalem. The top level was the priestly class, who were kind of okay with how things were, because many of them were being supported financially by Rome. They were benefiting from this relationship. And I'm sure some of them also just knew that this was not something that was going to end well, and that trying to fight Rome was futile, and it was just going to end in deaths. I'm sure there were some that also had genuine concerns, but there were definitely some that were benefiting from the situation. There were the farmers and the poor Jews who made up most of the rebels. Most of them were probably very young, who were completely against Rome, ready for Rome to be gone. And then there was the middle ground, where there were those who wanted Rome to be gone, who also weren't fond of the poor Jews who had run into Jerusalem and come to fight and wanted them to go back to your farms. So there was some class divisions in this group of people that unfortunately helped to undermine their strength. Even though more than likely Rome would have probably won anyway, the odds were skewed even more in Rome's favor because of these divisions that were based heavily on who was monetarily benefiting from Rome and who was suffering the most, the poor Jewish farmers. At the time, Israel was led by a Jewish family, by the Herods, but they had basically sold out and gone full Roman, because that was how they made their money, and they were partying, and they were just completely abusing the people. They were horrible. This was a time with a feeling of nationalism was rising. There were all these rebellions and these riots. There was hope. There was this feeling that, things are going to change, and the war starts, and 4 years later, Rome wins. Rome wins horribly, just burns Jerusalem, pillages, rapes, murders, kills. Bodies are piled in the streets. The blood, like rivers, ran through the city, and the temple is destroyed. More than just destroyed, they enter the holy sanctum and steal, most of the temple. This is the end of ancient Israel and the end of what was the original form of Judaism based around the temple and the state of Israel. And this is the beginning of what is called the diaspora. It had a huge impact on Judaism, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, but it also had a huge impact on Christianity because, as we've discussed, the ancient Christians, very few of them saw themselves as different from their Jewish brothers and sisters. They were Jews. They were raised Jewish. Jesus was a Jewish teacher. And it would take a few decades for the two groups to feel as if they were different groups. And this was a big event that played a major part in that, because the Christians did not fight in the war. They felt that, not so much that they liked Rome, and no, not at all. Obviously, Rome was what had been killing and persecuting them for so long, which we'll get to, but they had this sense that the end times were coming. There was this feeling that, Jesus had died and was going to one day come back, and the end times were going to come and the new kingdom was going to be at hand. And there was this feeling that surely that's going to happen any day now. Who cares about Rome? Bigger things are coming. And so the Christians, for this reason and some other reasons, they start to drift away from their brethren. We see in those early years some Jewish contemporaries of the Christians, like Josephus, this fellow here, who was a historian of Jewish and the history of that time, that the Christians were starting to be seen by both Rome and the Jews as a strange minority. Rome saw them as like superstitious. They didn't respect them in the way that they respected the Jews, because Judaism at least had this like ancient history. Christians were like upstarts that nobody liked. Unfortunately, that also happened in the Jewish community, which we'll discuss more with Mark. But there were these divisions where you see in a lot of early Christian writing that they felt really isolated and betrayed by a lot of their Jewish contemporaries to a certain extent. Many of them felt that they had been abandoned, that they felt betrayed by the synagogue or by the priests. There was a lot of anger between Jews and between Christians and Romans and Christians and Jews, but it wasn't safe to vent that anger at Rome. The Jews had unfortunately already suffered that. Obviously, some Christians would have suffered at that time as well. They were living in the area. No one escaped the horrors of this war. So in the aftermath, when literally the world has kind of ended, the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is gone, our country is destroyed, there's going to be so much pain and anger, and why did this happen? And answers to that question would raise a lot of anger and pain among both Christians and Jews, who some would say, oh, well, it's Jesus and his fault because he was, doing people that wanted to blame someone for the problem. And then there were others who said, it's because you turned against Jesus, God's punishing you. And there was just all this anger and hate being thrown around, because that's what happens when these huge traumatic events, these wars happen. There's going to be so much trauma and pain. And the books of the Bible, the very early Christian texts, are built on this trauma and pain, because the very first gospel was written in the middle of the war. Either the year 65 or somewhere around the year 70 when the war ended, which means that the first and oldest gospel, which we now know as the Gospel of Mark, was written in the midst of one of the most traumatizing, brutally violent events of this era. So there's no way to separate out how we feel about Jesus and how the text is written, and separate that from this horrible event that changed the lives of so many Christians and Jews of the era. Let's get down, before we dive in more into Mark and what he wrote, let's talk about general differences between the Jews, the Christians, and the pagans, which is kind of what we've been building up to. So we've discussed Rome and Rome's various beliefs, what they think is normal for marriage, what they think is normal for sex. We've discussed that with Jews as well, and now we're going to touch on what Christians think. So comparing them, you get to see some of the reasons why these various groups were not seeing eye to eye. We've discussed how the Romans, not fans of multiple marriages, but they're cool if you divorce, cool with most forms of sexuality, even if they are a little judgmental about how you do it or who you do it with. Circumcision was weird, not something they practiced, and they were worshipers of multiple gods. It was very easy for them to absorb other gods. That was not a big issue. Now, the Jews, however, polygamy was something that was cool in their history. Not necessarily practiced at the time, but in the ancient world, the more people you were married to, the more chances that you could have kids, and we're nomads, and we need kids. Same reason, homosexuality was kind of looked down upon, but probably not as heavily punished or policed as modern Christians would say or imply. It was probably something that, like, the priestly class was like, hey, no, but most people who did it probably got away with it. Abortion, contraception, public nudity, pantheism, no-nos. They were not fond of those. Not something they enjoyed. Now, what did the early Christians like? Nothing. We see very quickly, very early on, a major shift in terms of thought about how to live your life and be a good person in terms of Christianity, where polygamy, divorce, infanticide, homosexuality, abortion, contraception, public nudity, circumcision, pantheism, marriage, no, none of it. And why? Well, they've just lived through this horrible traumatic experience. They are part of this new faith that they believe is eventually going to lead to a new kingdom. The end times will come. And while they are believing this and building up this new faith, everyone around them is dying. Not just because of these wars, but because they don't have the protections that the Jewish people have. And so they are being targeted and martyred constantly. By the time that Mark writes his gospel, Jesus is dead, John is dead, James is dead, Paul is dead, Peter is dead. All of them martyred, killed and tortured. I mean, this is a horrible time to be a Christian. So what does that mean? If you think the end times are coming, war and death is all around you, all of your friends are being tortured and killed, what does that mean? This is an emergency time. This is time to buckle up, get ready for the end times, let's preach the word. That is what matters. At this point, Christians, early Christians, especially Paul, who we'll discuss, was preaching celibacy. You don't get married, you don't have kids. Why would you want to have kids? Tomorrow the world will explode. Tomorrow the end times are coming. No kids, no marriage, no sex. We have more important things to talk about. And you see, that's the start of ancient Christianity's approach with sexuality. This idea that there are more important things. Not necessarily that marriage or sex are evil or sinful, but that right now we have so much to deal with. So much to deal with right now. Let me go to my chat. Da, 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 da. We have another sacrifice. Oh, did someone already ban him? I just jumped into the chat and he's not there. Thank you if anyone banned him, or maybe the YouTube just blocked his comments. Works for me. I'll ban him after. Where was I? Someone interrupted me. Right. Having no fun. When you feel that you are in the end times, when you feel like there is something going to destroy the world, you can't really focus on getting married. You can't really, all those kind of things are not going to be part of your life. This kind of war that was on the horizon that they felt was coming is not going to work well with having a normal life and a normal marriage. Someone's being very, very weird. How do I get rid of you, sir? I don't know why YouTube... I guess YouTube's just way better at banning things than... Anyway. The haters are back. That's okay. I know I'm so beautiful. It's hard to be so jealous of how awesome I am. I know how it pains you. It's understandable. It's okay. Wow, did y'all hear that? It's been raining and thundering literally all day. Here we go. Oh, why'd you do that, YouTube? There we go. Now we are good. Oh, I didn't realize I actually put it on BRB. Anyway, we were talking about how Christians don't want to have any fun. You think about the kind of life they lived and the world they were living in. Of course, they're not going to be thinking about marriage and sexuality and having kids. Chastity was the most important thing to them, which had a really interesting effect on the way that they lived their lives in the early years. And it freed up a lot of people who didn't want to live according to normal social values. Women had way more freedom at this time. A lot of women were attached to the idea of being preachers and teachers, which they were allowed to do at this point. Most people in that era, women had to get married, have kids, whether you were Jewish or Roman, there was a kind of an expectation. Maybe better than most societies or older societies, but there was this expectation. If you were a Christian, the only expectation was to preach the word, to follow the word. You didn't have to get married. You didn't have to have kids. I mean, basically, you could leave traditional society and become something of an asexual monk. And for a lot of people, that was better than the world that they had before, than that was not the life they wanted. And so Christianity was a way to choose a different life. I could imagine a lot of people who were not attached to a heterosexual norm being attached to a non-sexual identity with Christ. That doesn't mean that everyone that joined Christ was not sexual, because we will see some letters that complain about certain Christians having too much fun when we get to Paul. There are multiple stories in various Gospels that show that Jesus is presented as not being that big a fan of sex and romance. Not in a necessary case, again, that it is sinful, but that it's not the point. When asked about divorce, Jesus says, no, don't divorce. There's this sense that he's kind of chiding people for, in both Roman and to a certain extent Jewish culture, treating divorce as kind of an easy thing. Like, I'm just tired of her, I'm going to get a new one. Where Jesus is like, you know what? If you're going to marry, that's a promise. You stick with it. Not necessarily saying, bad relationship. That's not, don't think about it in a modern sense where for us, divorce is usually for a really bad situation or an unhappy marriage. Back then it would have been for economic or political reasons, and he's saying that's not good enough. You've made a promise, do what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And that was, man, both Romans and Jews could not imagine not divorcing. That was really weird. And then someone said to him in response, well, in that case, who would want to get married? And Jesus agrees. He says, yeah, you're right. If you can't stay married, don't get married. It's better to be chaste anyway. He praises barren women and eunuchs, who in Jewish tradition weren't that great, because Judaism really prized children, because that was historically so necessary. So they would have been, again, as we say, the Judaism that we will discuss in the Gospels is not necessarily at all reflective of real Judaism, but there is a sense that these are Jewish people poking at some of the flaws of the traditions they came from, in the sense that, your ability to have kids was valued more highly. So a barren woman would be valued less. Whereas Jesus says, no, it's great to be barren. What does polygamy mean? That's multiple marriages. Let's see. The reason that Jews, for a certain extent, were kind of angry about this, because many of these people, to them, in their mind, these people were not following the laws, because Jesus at multiple points in the gospel says there's more important things to do. Remember, the Christians are acting like this is wartime. They think the end times are coming. And in certain dramatic periods of history, Jewish people are allowed to stop following the strict laws because of a need for survival or to prioritize something else. And Jesus enacts that and says, this is important times right now. We can't worry about, keeping purity laws. We've got to tell everybody the good word. And the Jews are like, you guys are breaking all the rules. What the heck? There's this sense of feeling like, to a certain extent, these are just radicals who don't want to follow the law, who are just completely misguided. Whereas the Romans saw it as far different. They saw it as very dangerous. Remember, this is a cult that said what matters most is not getting married and having kids and being in a society. Jesus at multiple points says things, whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. He rejects his own family in Mark, and I believe in one of the other Gospels as well. This is a cult that says it is more important that you believe in God. Your nation, your family, your bloodline don't matter. It's not important to be Roman. It's not important to have families. It's important to believe in God. Leave your nation, leave your family, come worship God. That's really revolutionary, especially for this time period. Your nation and your religion and your ability to have kids and get married, that's the social structure. Get married, have your kids, work in society, make money. You can't just leave and go do whatever you want. Also, something that was held against the Christians at this time period was the fact that they would go into the poorest places. They would speak to slaves. They would speak to the lower class and talk to them about Jesus. So there was these accusations from the Romans that Christianity was a religion for the ignorant and the stupid because they were preaching to these people. And old Christian commentaries would say, yeah, we do go preach to them. You're right. You know, not only the literate deserve to hear the word of God, you know, they would go to all those people, which again, the Romans weren't exactly excited about the fact that Christianity was talking to their poorer people and their slaves and telling them to love God, because this was a God that again preached putting God above everything, not the gods of the Romans, different God, loving and taking care of people, the idea that God made man and woman in his image, all men and women, the very idea that every human being has value because God made them goes against the idea of slavery and the social hierarchy of Rome. Because Rome says that no, some people aren't worth as much. If everyone's worth the same thing, then slavery is against God. Christianity had a built-in argument against the idea of slavery, and it was very dangerous because if enough slaves decided they didn't like being slaves, Rome was in trouble. So very quickly early on, Rome came down hard on Christians just for being Christian. To claim to be Christian was enough to get you killed. We will talk about a couple of different martyrs here. First of all, let's scroll down to where I put my martyrs. Did I put them out of order? Oh, I guess martyrs were next time. But let's talk about some martyrs anyway, because there's a period of about 300 years where to be Christian in this era was incredibly dangerous. There was a story of there was a woman who was married to a man. She was Christian, and she didn't really want to be with her husband because he was still very Roman, and he was having these lavish sex parties that she did not want to be part of. So she wanted to divorce him, and he wouldn't do it. So they went before a judge, and the judge ruled to kill the Christian who taught the wife about Christianity. And a man in the audience of this place, in the court, said, "What kind of ruling is this? He's, holding his wife hostage and not, doing such horrible things, and you're going to kill the guy that taught her to be more moral?" And the judge says, "Are you a Christian?" And the man says, "Yes, I am." And the judge orders the man be executed. Ooh, boy, just to stand up in court and say, "This is morally wrong, I am a Christian," was enough to get you a death sentence. And not just a death sentence. These were people being, hung on the cross, put into the Colosseums to be killed and tortured for a show. They were being brutally killed very early on because the nature of Christianity, what they were preaching was so subversive. Most Romans were fine with other religions as long as they made the token effort to honor the imperial cult. That was the problem, that Christianity wasn't doing that. Most of the Christians who get martyred are the ones that say, well, no, we don't want to worship that God. If they honored the emperor, then they could kind of get away with it. But throughout Rome, they were still writing constantly about how horrible Christianity was, how ignorant it was, how dangerous it was. And if they didn't honor the emperor, or if, like that one guy, he stood up and, talked back to the judge, they could very easily, for very small reasons, being killed. Very easily. Christians started actively making a nuisance of themselves. That is also true, that they did at certain points stand up and try and get involved in stopping things and that they didn't agree with. But there were also a lot of cases where this was a difference in morality that ended with murder, ended with the Christians getting killed. These are people that, for the most part, just wanted to live their own lives and do their own thing, and they are being murdered for it. There was a woman who was pregnant that was kept in the prison until she gave birth, and then brought with her and some other Christians that were arrested for not honoring the emperor. Her father begged her to do it, and Perpetua was her name, refused because she wanted to be honoring to God, which, meant that you can't honor anybody else over God. And in the arena, they first threw them in naked, and then the crowd was like, well, okay, maybe don't throw in the women that just had a baby naked. That's a little much. So they clothed them and threw them back in, and they were mauled by a bull, tortured, and then finally at the end, Perpetua, there's a gladiator that's got hold of her, and Perpetua reaches out for the sword and pulls it to her neck. Wow. Like, there's a lot of really fascinating stories about these early Christians, and to just put it all into perspective, where these were people that had just seen their homeland torn to pieces. The culture they grew up with, they feel, has betrayed them. There are mentions in various pieces of the Bible where Jesus will say things like, you will be beaten in the synagogues, you will be thrown out, possibly referencing times when their Jewish family members or community turned on them. We'll never know entirely for sure how much is that is just the author creating from whole cloth or creating from things that they knew that their fellow Christians had experienced. Because again, they are writing about things that happened to their what they felt about the community that they came from. The anger towards the Jewish community was an inter-community anger. It was only later that stuff that's written in the Bible is going to be taken by Christians and used to hurt and punish a minority, where the power and the relationship there will change. But in this period, when this stuff's being written, the Christians are a Jewish minority writing about their fellow Jews and the anger that they felt and the pain that they felt at what they perceived as rejection and abandonment. Which gets us to actually talking about the Gospels that were written about Jesus, which are the definitely the basis of Christianity. They're not the earliest documents about Christianity that exist, and not even in the Bible. Paul's letters were written first, but we will talk about him secondarily. The Gospels were written about 30 years after Jesus' life. Now, we should have a timeline. Jesus died somewhere between 30 and 36 CE. He was probably like 30, 33 years old, something. I think 33 is the traditionally accepted time. He preached for about 3 years, and then he was killed. Paul, who was, as I've mentioned, a guy that wrote a lot of letters, he was really, really important to developing the early church, and also his letters have a lot of influence on how Christians view sexuality. We will talk about him second. But he dies before or during the war at some point. There is a terrible great fire in Rome in 64, this big old fire that Nero probably started, but Nero blames the Christians. If I remember right, he skins a bunch of Christians and then lights them on fire to create human torches. It's really rough. James, who is another of the disciples, I think some traditions say he was Jesus's brother. He died somewhere in 60, 68. Peter, major, he's like the father of the church in Catholic tradition, dies 64, 68. So a lot of these guys die before or during the war, which is from 66 to 70. And so we see the first gospel written in and around the war itself, after all these major figures have died. Why? At this point, it had been almost like 20, 30 years since Jesus' death, and a lot of his thoughts and his beliefs had been passing around through oral tradition and being written down as well by a bunch of different people with a lot of different historians have discovered a chunk of early Roman persecution has been exaggerated by later Christian writers. I would not be surprised by that. I would not. But I feel like the texts I've been reading that have been referring to earlier stuff, I think are pretty solid. I mean, we have pretty good evidence that a lot of folks were killed. A lot. From secondary sources, too. From, like, Greek and from Jewish writing about what those wild Christians were doing. The Romans did not like Christians. I can't say how many of those Christians were murdered. A lot of them probably kept their head down. But there was a lot of hatred going on. Mostly I discuss this to talk about why the Christian writing is so angry. There's a lot of anger and feelings of betrayal, especially towards the Jews. We will get to that. The first gospel is written somewhere around 68, 70, probably because so many of the fathers are dying, and there's this feeling that we're going to lose a lot of these thoughts and traditions and teachings of Jesus if we don't start really writing it down. And Mark is the first one to do that. And we owe so much of Christianity's ideals and ways of talking about Jesus to Mark. The man, Mark, was a assistant to Peter. Tradition says he's the one that wrote it, but it probably wasn't him. It was some unknown, unnamed person that we'll probably never actually identify. Now, as we are about to talk about the Gospels, I have a stupid joke. We were going to talk about the Gospels, so it is time. Warning for flashing lights. Alright, how do I turn this off? How do I turn you off? There we go. So, what does the word gospel mean? Where does the word gospel come from? I hope y'all could actually hear that, or it just looks like I'm dancing to nothing. It comes from the Greek word evangelion, which means good news. That always makes me laugh whenever I watch that show. The gospel was a new kind of literary technique. The term gospel wouldn't really be invented until like a couple decades, 100 years later, but it was a style of biography that involved theology. The idea of this is the life of Jesus from a religious standpoint, meant to convey a message. Whereas biographies were meant to tell history, the Gospels weren't necessarily meant to be true history. They were meant to be a depiction of Jesus' life from a religious standpoint. This is what his life means theologically. Mark was the first one to do this. There are 4 of them that are canonical to the Christian Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in that order. We know Mark was written first because of various ages of texts, the words they're chosen, but especially because Matthew and Luke both borrow heavily from Mark. Studies of the texts, which I think I have my map here. No, well, that's Mark. Hi, Mark. There we go. That's pretty small. Let me make it bigger. So studies of the text seem to reveal that the Mark text appears again in both Matthew and Luke in a lot of ways, and in certain places both Matthew and Luke will match, but for the most time when they match Mark, which, you know, without going into a lot of really complex literary discussion kind of thing, basically they have proof through a lot of study that Mark is probably the oldest one. Neon Genesis Good News, a show that's rather depressing with a confusing ending. I mean, you know, you can kind of, some of the Gospels are basically that. Mark is basically that, let's be real. We will read some of Mark. How do I make you small again, Mark? How do I make you small again? Oh, there we go. A lot of literary study has revealed the age of certain parts of the Bible, which parts are older, which parts were added. We will talk all about that another day in an episode devoted to like the building of the Bible over time. The point now is just to prove that Mark was the first one, which means that Mark is the one that's going to really help establish how Christians feel about Christianity. And at the time, there were a lot of ideas about Christ going around. There were lots of prophets and healers and magical people and magicians and philosophers floating around in the old world. So there were people that were like, you know, oh, he sounds cool. How did he do all those magic tricks? Teach me your magical ways. And then there were philosophers who were like, oh, so he's a philosophic teacher? I'd like to read his philosophical works. You know, there were all these interpretations. And the writer of Mark wanted to set out and create an interpretation of Jesus that they felt was the point of Jesus's ministry, which was salvation and faith in God in a specific way. He switches the story to focus in on what he felt was most important for a very good reason, and that is the death and resurrection. If you actually look at Mark, the text is developed in a way that it builds to the crucifixion as a kind of a climax point and then goes down from there. And Jesus foreshadows that event throughout the text, and the people following him are constantly confused by it. There's this sense of mystery to it where he'll heal people and tell them, don't tell anyone, it's a secret. He is resurrected and he tells the women, don't tell anyone, it's a secret. There's this sense of mystery to it. He wanted to combat some ideas that were popular at the time that focused on Jesus as magician, Jesus as philosopher, the idea that the destruction of the temple and the war were the end times and Jesus was coming now. He wanted to point out that no, Jesus comes when Jesus will say he come. Oh, thank you, Nacho. Sorry. I didn't see that. I was getting into my chat, but thank you. Is it Gandalf or Bobrog? When I say hi, Bobrog. The only one that ever sits in my lap is this one. You say hello? Say, no, put me down. So Mark was writing for a lot of reasons. He felt, we don't know if it's a he or not, probably a he based on the writings, that there were important points to be made, that there were things that the Christian community was not understanding that he wanted them to understand. But there were problems he had to deal with. For one, he's writing about 30 years after Jesus' death, after a horrible war has happened, after the destruction of the temple. It feels like Rome is just doing whatever it wants and the world is ending and changing. So as a follower of Jesus, how do you handle the fact that Jesus is dead? How do you create a faith and a following around presumably a guy that failed? Many people at the time, as I was discussing earlier, felt all this betrayal and this anger at one another. Everyone was suffering and dying, and there was this question of why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening to all of us? The answer that he developed was a fusion of a lot of different things and a really fascinating story where, again, the focus is on the resurrection, but in the sense that his death was a victory. There's this addition to the story that Mark creates a narrative that's based on a cosmic battle. Sure, Jesus died and the Romans killed him, but there's a bigger struggle going on. There is something cosmic at work here. There are Satans and there are angels and God and the devil, and that is where you start to see the essence of Christianity build up. For one, it's the first use of Satan as a guy, and not just a general Jewish adversary. It's a very specific figure. It is the first time that we see the tradition of the apostles being unable to understand Jesus because he's something other than us. He is the Son of God. Well, when Jews talk about Son of God, there's some use of the word God, the word Father, as a term for God. We are all God's children, and so it was not uncommon for preachers to call God Father. Well, Mark takes it further, and whether or not it's a Markan invention, I'm not entirely sure, but he definitely solidifies the idea that Jesus is the literal Son of God, part of a Trinity. This pulls a lot from the mystery religions of the time, which is a tradition in Rome and the Middle East and various places, Egypt, where there were kind of culty traditions where people would enter into this secret society. And the focus of these were figures, gods who were gods that died and were reborn. A lot of these cults tended to preach that if you follow our stuff, we can figure out how to circumvent death. You too can die and come back. But there was a very famous concept of a god that dies and returns. And Mark took that idea and he changed it around and made it a god that dies and returns. And the death itself is miraculous and creates this, this is why he came down. He came down to die and suffer with us. And now he's back. This was a familiar thing to the ancient world, especially the Gentiles. They knew about gods that died and came back. Jesus was immediately recognizable to them. Now, we got to talk about how Mark handles Jews. He doesn't handle them well, but he attacks specific people. In the narrative, you have to have bad guys. And the bad guys in Mark's narrative are the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians. Those are various groups of Jewish people. Upper class Jewish people. Remember that this is a time where they had just had this war, and in the war there were divisions between the upper class and the lower class, where the upper class wanted to stop the fighting because they made money off Rome, and the lower class were the ones being exploited, so they wanted to fight back. So even outside of Jewish and Christian divisions, there was a general poor people sense of the upper class of Judaism has failed us. Our priests and our scribes have failed us to a certain extent. And so Mark turns them into the bad guys. There's a lot of theories about why. One, the war, this feeling of betrayal and pain. More general, like, instances in private lives where people may have felt rejected by their Jewish family members who wouldn't follow Christ, or Jews that didn't react well when family left, because Christ was, saying, leave your father and your mother and you don't get married. Like, it was very rebellious stuff. And so you could see how older folks, established in the community would be upset with their young kids who were leaving home and disobeying all the rules they'd grown up with. There was this sense that there was a really a very big break, that they just could not cross that divide. The idea that it has a lot to do with the divisions in class can be found in the actual text itself. Jesus discusses how a house divided against itself cannot stand. And he also is very negative about money. I mean, the whole thing about the rich guy can't go through the eye of a needle, blah, blah, blah. You're never going to go to heaven. Getting angry at the money changers. There's lots of lines discussing how the best thing to do is to be poor. There's a guy that comes to him and is like, how can I be, more holy? And he's like, well, you're rich, sell all your stuff. And he leaves. He's like, And that's when Jesus is like, well, it's going to be hard for rich people to get into heaven. In general, a lot of the feelings in this text that have to do with the Jewish people has more to do with class than it does with religion, even though hundreds of years later, Christians would use it to persecute the Jewish people. One of the big things that becomes in the medieval mind a weapon against Judaism is the idea that the Jews killed Jesus. No, they didn't. Rome killed Jesus. But why does the Bible portray it that way? Well, one, it's very likely that the early Christians wanted to present themselves as friendly and meek as possible to the Romans. They didn't want to be murdered more than was already happening with Peter and Paul, possibly. They wanted to appear friendly. So the Romans that show up in the text, for the most part, are pretty likable. Pontius Pilate is the famous version of this, where he's the guy that says, do you want me to set Jesus free, or shall you have me kill him? And it's the Jewish crowd that says, kill him. And there's literally a line in one of the Gospels that says, his blood on our children's heads. Like, fuck, Jesus, no. Pontius Pilate was a horrible man. And other sources in the realm of that era, from Jews, from Romans, from various people, show that he was a total tyrant. He was a monster. If anyone killed Jesus, it was Pontius Pilate. But the text portrays him as washing his hands of it, of blaming the other people, the Jewish leaders, because, in part, this sense of feeling betrayed by the upper class, these divisions between the Jewish community, and the feeling that they didn't want to draw the Roman eye more than they already had. In fact, proof of the fact that this kind of Jewish blame was kind of invented is the fact that there's two stories of Jesus being pulled before the Jews. When he's arrested at the mountain, there's this story that they took him straight to the council and they tried to come up with lies. There's this really horrible kind of image painted where he is in front of all these people yelling and spitting and blaming at him and trying to come up with false reasons to kill him. And then it says, and then the next morning he was brought before the Jews. Like, well, one, the Jewish community, the Sanhedrin, the judging group that we discussed yesterday, wouldn't have met in the middle of the night to judge a guy? No. Two, they were, very overtly, comically made evil. It just doesn't make any sense. The one in the morning is far shorter, and basically they hand him over to Pontius Pilate, which is probably what actually happened. That the Romans arrested him. They brought him before the general leaders of Israel, who don't have the ultimate power. The Roman governor does. The Roman governor kills him. We probably won't ever know the exact real events of how he died, or really of most of his life. There are parts that we can tell really happened based on how they're written, the complexity. We'll discuss it another day, but there are pieces that are definitely creations for specific reasons. And this was created in part to vent the fact that there was all this anger and pain going on, to create a bad guy for the story because it needed one and it couldn't be a Roman. And the fact that, Mark is discussing inter-Jewish communal problems because they all still very much, a lot of early Christians considered themselves Jews too, or at the least came from Jewish families. So this is not Christians versus Jews. This is Jews versus Jews having issues with one another. It would be at least like 100 years before they were really cleanly split. There's some fun things going on in this text. We discussed how there's, this conflict of good and evil. There's this hatred of the rich. It's also the only text that doesn't really dive into the more religious aspects of Jesus. Matthew and Luke are going to invent some things that make Jesus even more kind of godly than he is already. Mark does not have a divine birth. There's no appearance after his death, or no resurrections. He tells people to keep quiet and not to spread word of him, because he's trying to, basically, there's this focus on the idea that while Jesus is alive, his people can't really understand him. It's only through his death that he's really known. It foretells the coming war. He uses Jesus to foretell the falling of the temple and the terrible things that are going to happen. And it is a story where all the apostles, everybody basically fails to understand him. Nobody really is portrayed in a good light. Probably because Mark is having this more bitter version of the text where war is still going on, everybody's feeling betrayed, everybody fails Jesus. Jesus is the only kind of purely good character in this narrative. It focuses on his authority to be a leader of the Jews, trying to prove to his fellow Jews that, yeah, Jesus had the authority. He is a Jewish teacher that we should all respect, trying to prove that he's not some kind of heretic. There's a lot of focus on the power of belief and the fact that he is a Messiah. This is the story that starts with John the Baptist baptizing him, which is connected to Jewish tradition, kind of trying to, again, say, look, John the Baptist baptized him. Like, this is a Jewish man come to save us, trying to really create this authority for him and make it authentic, that this is not heretical. Jesus is a Jew come to teach us, save us, all that. Instances like John the Baptist baptizing Jesus are one of the things that we know probably happened, because the instance of it creates problems theologically. Like, if something happened in the story that is not easy to explain, it probably happened historically. In this case, having your Messiah baptized by a human being, that's strange, isn't it? That kind of implies that John has the authority to baptize Jesus. Does Jesus have sins that need baptized? Like, because that creates theological issues, it probably did happen. Interesting how these things are worked out. Now we are going to discuss two sections of Mark. Ow, Bob, why did you do this? Ow, that was my foot. Okay, well, actually, before we do, oh, there, that's the, I don't know why. I'm going to have to put these change picture markers in different colors because I keep missing them. Those are the gathering of the upper class of the Jews, possibly the Pharisees. I'm not entirely sure. And that's Pontius Pilate judging Jesus. He always looks so pretty, even though he's supposed to be dying. Where did the image go? Oh, here we go. So, some interesting things about Mark as a text. We know that Mark probably was writing from outside of the Middle East, outside of Israel, maybe Egypt, maybe Rome, because he didn't know the geography of the place. One story says that he went from Tyre to Sidon, which, let's make this really big so we can all see how bad he was at geography. Okay, so you see Tyre is up there above that lake, and Sidon was the place above it. But he says he goes to Sidon via the Decapolis and then arrives at the Lake of Galilee. Do you see the problem with that? It says basically that he went from this city and went south to get north, which is not obviously what could have possibly happened. Like, that's not how geography works. But that's just an instance of something that proves what, was going on with this text. Someone was writing about these events from outside of that country, possibly someone that left after the war and was living somewhere else in the Roman Empire. I just think that's really fun. All right, I think that was... Yeah, that's our scribe. We will get to him. I guess we'll keep it in our funny little image there. Let's talk about 2 sections of Mark that vaguely kind of deal with sexuality. Mark, really, for the most part, sex is not something that Mark deals with. Not something that Jesus deals with. He has bigger fish to fry. He has souls to save. He is going to talk about how power and money corrupt. He's going to talk about how important it is to be a good person, to forgive. There's this really heavy focus on do not judge others, lest ye judge yourself, that kind of thing. But there are 2 sections that I think can kind of describe vaguely sexual things that they can be applied to sexuality. Let's get my book. Ye old book. Let's see, where is our Mark? Where did I put you? I'm having to go through... Oh, there he is. All right. Marky Mark. Section 7 is what we are looking at today. This is a discussion that actually has to do with the purity laws and things. Like, the Pharisees come up to Jesus and are like, you're not following the rules. You're not washing your hands before you eat. And Jesus is making this argument, one, that there are bigger things going on right now. We can't always worry about following the rules. And 2, that he has the authority to break the rules because he is the Son of God. There's this specific section where they're talking about the foods that are inappropriate to eat. And Jesus says, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. When he'd left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out the sewer? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. For one, you can kind of approach the nothing outside that goes in defiles from a sexual angle. But also, he goes on to say that it is specific kinds of sexual acts and other things that can be defiling to a person. Essentially saying that it's what you do and what you feel and act on that defines how clean you are. Remember, this is about purity rules and what's appropriate to eat and what's important and appropriate to put in the body. And the words that he uses in the ancient Greek, because that's the original language that this was written in, refer to things that are not necessarily related to sexuality. He uses porneia, which is illicit sexual intercourse, but it had to do with pagan idolatry. It had to do, again, with the fact that sex was often wrapped up in pagan religions and their events. Other references that he makes, poneros is evilness, blasphemy he refers to, pride, senselessness, basically acting with foolishness or folly. Essentially, the word poneros, especially, that he ends with, is evil that causes pain and sorrow. In the moral sense, something that is evil. So these are things that cause problems. And all of them come from, a sense of not controlling yourself. Not sex is evil, but that illicit sexual, like being one of these wild pagans, is what is considered evil. That is what he says here. And then the second thing we're going to just briefly talk about, we kind of already talked about, which is Jesus and divorce, which also is a scene where a bunch of Pharisees come up to test him and say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." Then in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Well, that's pretty harsh, ain't it? Well, that's one thing you could tell anybody that wants to try and tell you that, if you're going to live by the strictest rules of the Bible, you can never divorce ever. But really, that's not necessarily what this is about. Because again, this is one of those scenes where the Mark has this tradition in the book where the high-class Jewish group, the Pharisees, will come up and try and trick Jesus into some kind of theological problem where there's no right answer, and they can drive a wedge between Jesus and the people. And in response, Jesus says, "Well, it's never okay to divorce." Which is not something anyone in the old world would have said. That was just normal life. He is essentially throwing back at them and saying, you're so used to this idea that it's just that easy to give up and give up on your wife. And he says, you know what? Don't do it. And if you can't not divorce, then don't get married. Which is, I think, a refreshing idea placed into the context of that time where men often, because in Judaism only men could really get divorced for the most part, sometimes between families it would be arranged, but men had more power there. And in Rome it was different. Everybody could kind of do it willy-nilly, way more easily than the Jewish people did, who saw it a little more seriously. But still, Jesus is kind of saying that maybe, we should think twice about how easily we treat this, what's supposed to be a very important partnership, and we're just, what should we allow ourselves to do divorce with? And one of the things that colors my view of this scene is the fact that there's an old Jewish text that discusses what's appropriate for divorce, and one of the old teachers said that if she burns dinner, it is appropriate to divorce her. One of them, I think, said, if she just seems unlovely. Like, really horrid things to say where, you can divorce her on a whim, basically. And remember that in this society, it was much harder for a woman without a male family member. If they didn't have a father, a husband, or a son, they had a lot more difficulty in life. And since they could not normally initiate divorce, that's a really hard position to be in. So honestly, here, I think there's a lot of traditional values that Jesus is coming up against that aren't necessarily a thing in our society, and so I don't really think apply with us. It does have these lines about God made them male and female, and a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, which I've heard quoted at me about 1,000 times. But there's a lot of variation on interpretations with that line. It's really hard for us to discuss what the Bible means without eventually just devolving into what were the original terms? What did the original manuscript say? And in another episode, we are going to discuss why it's so hard. But there is some vagary, there's some vagueness about this section where it could be referring to incest, that you have to leave your home to go marry someone else. It doesn't necessarily mean, heterosexual is the only way to go. Obviously, that's kind of the most that's ever said with Jesus about sexuality is this line about a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. We will discuss it in more detail in the episode about translation and all that jazz. That is most of really what is related to sex and gender in Mark. For the most part, what he's trying to discuss is the pain of Jesus and the suffering of Jesus, how he knows his death is coming and he faces it and overcomes it through this resurrection. Because he's, again, writing during war when a lot of people are dying, and he's trying to basically to give people a map of how to face suffering and death with dignity. Trying to show them how Jesus suffered and died, but he was resurrected and has now, saved our souls. And so you can, face this with dignity, knowing that Jesus died for you and God loves you and the end times are coming. Basically kind of something to comfort these people that were struggling so much in such a hard era of history. I should get one of my lozenges. We have one more guy to talk about because it just seems fitting to talk about him here. And that is Paul, who we got. Yeah, there we go, Paul. When it comes to the New Testament, most of what you're going to see that discusses sexuality doesn't have to do with the Gospels at all. Like I said, Jesus didn't care that much about it. It wasn't something that had a lot to do with his ministry. He was very much focused more on general morality than he was about, like, traditions of marriage and sexuality. As I said, that's basically the main section that I remember him discussing it. But we will, again, go back into that more detailed. We'll probably just do a whole episode on Jesus. Whereas Paul, as we mentioned before, was an early member of the church who, in the 20 or so years after Jesus' death, spent his life traveling Europe and North Africa and the Middle East and converting people. He was a Jew, originally Saul of Tarsus, who was converted, but he always considered himself a Jew. There's a little argument about whether that... everything I've read seems to say that he was very connected to his Jewishness. He traveled and converted a lot of people and helped to build the early church system. He would go to a place and teach for a while and convert people, and then he would move on to go to another place. And he did this for like 20 years, eventually traveling to Rome. He was imprisoned for a while and eventually killed. I don't know as much about the end of his life. A lot of his life and the life of other apostles is in the Acts, which is a part of the New Testament that we will not discuss today. What we're going to discuss is some of Paul's letters. As he's traveling and converting all these people and creating these communities and then leaving to go to the next one, he would often, be asked questions, or he would hear that some community he left behind was misbehaving. And so he would write a letter back to them saying, hey, don't do that. And these letters would be read aloud because at the time, most people were probably getting their knowledge about Christianity from live readings because most people were not literate. And so people would gather together and listen to someone read this letter and then, discuss it. Paul had a lot of authority at this period of time, and his writings, 12 of them, are included in the book, the New Testament. I think it's 12, or is it 11? There's a lot of conflict about his letters that we'll discuss in the translation portion because recent scholarship has shown that not every letter written by Paul was written by Paul. Two of them we know are Romans and Corinthians 1, which is what we're going to look at today because they have two of the most famously quoted anti-homosexuality quotes of the Bible. Usually when you see someone who in Christianity does not approve of homosexuality, they may quote Leviticus, but the reason is the Pauline letters, because those are often what has been used over the years in Christian theological debates and writings to go back to and say, well, it says in Romans, don't do that. So what does it actually say? Romans opens up and he is saying, hello everyone, I'm Paul. You've probably heard of me. Here's what I think. I'm proud to be a Christian, yes. And unfortunately, there's so many of these people who claim to be Christians or are living around us who are just fools. They are fools. They have fallen for a trick, and they are living in bad ways. They are. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his internal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to deranged passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, yet they don't not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. Yikes! What does this all mean? Once again, we see that the association between homosexual acts is with paganism. The Christians of this area could not separate what the Romans were doing. You know, the very high class, powerful Romans, all these sacred prostitutes having their wild festivals and all this public nudity, which these people were not cool with. They could not separate all that away from homosexuality because that was a major version of it in their time period. So a lot of these associations with idolatry and sexuality come from that. Note, one major interpretation of this section is the idea that he is not writing against sexual acts, but against excessive sexuality, because that is often what, these big festivals were. One of the things he says is against natural use. Again, he uses a similar term that Romans at the time would use against female homosexuality, the idea that it's unnatural, doesn't happen in the natural world. Now, when he says deserve to die, he doesn't mean capital punishment. This is not, we're going to stone the gays to death. In this era, it was literally believed that death happens because you sin, and if we could just be perfect sinless beings, we might be immortal. He's basically saying they're going to die because they sin. They because of this association between the idolatry and homosexuality, will never be entirely capable of saying who he's addressing here. Is he addressing general homosexuality? Is he addressing sacred prostitutes? Is he addressing the early, high-level Romans that are, getting down with children? Like, who is he talking to? We're not entirely sure, and it's kind of vague. It also has to be said that he is very much against sex in general, because again, chastity was the major word of the era. We have too much to do. Paul was traveling around on foot in the ancient world, teaching the ways of Jesus and the Gospels, well, probably not existent Gospels at the time, teaching the words of Jesus. He didn't have time to be boning down. He had things to do, and he taught that to his followers. But you also have to remember, he's writing these letters to correct communities he left behind, which means the early Christian communities had some trouble with boning down. There were some people that could not do it. Now, certain letters of his actually toned down his anti-sexual terms. They are the ones of his students. We're all just kind of trying to figure it out, how we're going to just live as Christians. Once 100-some years pass and the end of the world hasn't happened, you start to see the Christian society start to settle down into something more normal, trying to assimilate to society around them. What do we do about marriage? What do we do about kids? And so some of Paul's letters are probably fakes made by people from later times to give them the authority of, oh, well, Paul says it's cool to marry. I know he said in that other letter that it's way cooler to be a virgin and a chaste and stuff, but no, you can have kids. Paul says so. He changed his mind. This happens a lot in the early church. There are a lot of writers who will just come back and go, oh, well, no, he actually said this because I say so. Because I wrote it here. See how I wrote it and I put his name there? That happened a lot, especially with Paul. At least 3 of his letters are confirmed not to be his. Let's go. So, the next one we were going to talk about is very short. Corinthians. Do you know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revelers, and robbers. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God. This is the only time he specifically says sodomite rather than alluding to inappropriate sexuality, which is very vague. And so we can kind of look at that and go, oh, well, maybe he means pederasty, maybe he means idolatry. Here, the word is translated literally to mean gay person, sodomite. Uh-oh. Well, if you actually look back at the original text, that's not the word that was there. The word that was there is a old Greek word that doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible, and in fact is so archaic we're not entirely sure what it means. Literally, it means man bed. Man bed. What does that mean? There's a theory that here he was literally saying male prostitutes. Possibly sacred prostitutes, again associating, because he is so against the idolatry and the sex of the pagans, maybe this is a term that referred to those sexual acts. But whatever it was, he didn't use the term that literally is used in Hebrew for sodomites. He used this other term that nobody recognizes. So probably that's an incorrect translation. So we could just write Corinthians off. That's not even against homosexuality. They just put that in there because they didn't know what the word meant. And they guessed, oh, well, male bed. Anyway, so far, since we will never be able to finish all of this Bible in one day, covering today the Gospel of Mark and letters, Romans and Corinthians from Paul, we see once again there really isn't a lot against homosexuality. Not really standing up, is it? There's a lot about sex in general because everybody's supposed to be chaste. Very interestingly, there's this early association with sex and gender as being non-important and even non-existent, where they're almost kind of this community of asexual, agender people, where obviously the terms for man are used to describe good people, but women were being described as masculine and manly in a sense that they were leaving behind traditional gender roles and being preachers, and oh, well, that's very manly of you. Very manly of you to love Christ so much. Very fascinating. We will discuss more actual specific people next time. This has been more of a general overview of the establishment of the earliest Christian texts, Mark and the letters of Paul, which would have all been written by 70 CE. The other Gospels will come around 90 CE, and then the last one might be 110, and most of the rest of the books probably were around that time. I don't remember when Acts was written, but all those would have been written much later than the ones we've just discussed. What that gives us is an early image of a church that is defining itself and trying to figure out how to function in a society where they feel isolated and alienated from their original community, from families, from their country, from Rome, really trying to figure out for themselves who they're going to be, and this sense that impending the end is coming. And so we should all basically just devote ourselves to God. And this idea that we should all just be very chaste teachers of God. And some people did follow that. We will talk about some historical women that basically lived like sexless, genderless monks who loved Jesus. But there probably were also some who didn't live it. If these ancient, Pauline letters are any sign that he was writing back and saying, hey, stop that, Even then, he's so very vague that it's more than likely he was writing about pagans, especially the letter to Romans. If he's writing to Rome, that's the heart of the pagan enterprise. It's entirely possible and even very, very likely that these ancient societies, this breaking of tradition where these folks were going out and women were doing their own thing, not having to get married, how many of them were traveling together, teaching together? There were actually a lot of really old instances of kind of sisterhoods where, like, women were traveling and preaching and living together. And some of them are mentioned in the Bible, even during Jesus' life and then after his life. How many of those were? There may have also been men doing the same thing. There are theories about Jesus, which we will not talk about today, but Jesus had a buddy. It's impossible to know for sure any specific historical actual examples because they weren't written about. Because again, we'll discuss more next time, but the people that were writing at the time, much like we said yesterday with the Jewish community, it was the scribes and the priests and the upper class. Same thing with the Christians, because the early Christians, while most of them were poor, the ones who could write were not. Paul was a former Jew with a lot of power and authority, and had a decent amount of money, former member of the priest class. Many of the other early Christian writers, like Clement, would also be pretty well off. So they don't necessarily represent the real lives of the poor Christians that were walking away from their families and creating new families with these fellows in Christ, and who probably did fall in love and get together. And if they didn't have, I'm sure some of them got married heterosexually, and some of them probably didn't. And even those that, didn't get married or didn't fall in love were using Christianity as a way to escape traditional values. Christianity, in a sense, was itself queer because it presented a minority sexual gender identity where we don't expect you to get married. We don't expect you to behave as a wife or as a woman. We just expect you to love God. And that drew a lot of people. Very fascinating. We will discuss more next time. Probably not tomorrow because I have a lot of stuff going on. I'm going to be house sitting over the weekend. I may try and stream a game before I leave. We'll see. But I'm going to give the weekend to prepare the next couple slides because I keep there's so much to cover and so much I keep fussing with what I'm going to decide to talk about. But we'll talk about more next time, including Thecla. If you've never heard of Thecla, she's fun. She's great. She's a badass. Thanks again for listening, and thank you to all of our members like Nacho, Jeff, Daniel, Schneiderline. You guys are amazing, and the reason that I can do all this. Thank you for supporting me through all the various changes and things that I've been doing. This has meant a lot to me, and something I've always wanted to do. And I have gotten some good responses, some bad responses, but that doesn't matter. We're getting rid of the douchebags. Thanks again, and I will see you guys on Monday for more God Loves Gays. Bye.